Jesus made thousands of decisions and never made a sinful one. Think about that. A lot of decisions, no sinful one. When Jesus found himself in a difficult political discussion, he had a perfect evaluation of the matter. When Jesus talked about legal matters, even things like taxation, he had perfect judgment. When Jesus talked about difficult relational conflicts, he had perfect judgment. Jesus is the ultimate decision maker. And in a world where our decisions, the amount of our decisions is only accelerating, we need a perfect decision maker, a righteous judge who can come alongside us and help us. That person is Jesus. Here's the take-home message. I learn right judgment by looking to the righteous judge. I learn right judgment by looking to the righteous judge. This morning in these verses, Jesus is going to teach us how to judge rightly in a world where we desperately need to learn how to make good judgments. And so we're going to start by looking at John 7, 1 through 9. We're going to talk about Jesus and his Father's timing. So look at verse 1 with me. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the feast of booths was at hand. So his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come." After this, he remained in Galilee. So at this point in the Gospel of John, the hostility against Jesus is just ramping up. The Jewish authorities are now seeking to kill him. And the time of year at this point in John is the Feast of Booths. The Feast of Booths took place during the fall season of our year, so September through October, and this feast is going to be the setting for all of John 7 and John 8. Now, this was a very popular feast among the Jews. In fact, among the big three, with Passover, Pentecost, and Booths, according to the historian Josephus, the Booths was actually the most popular feast. The people loved this celebration. And what they would do is they would commemorate their ancestors' trek through the wilderness by building these makeshift huts or booths or tabernacles, another name for it, to stay in. And the ceremonies they'd engage in were a water drawing ceremony and a lamp lighting ceremony. So the two major themes of booths were water and light. Now, why is that important? Well, what are Jesus' two I am statements in John 7 and 8? Water and light. He says, "I am the living water. I am the light of the world." Remember back in John 6, he said, "I am the bread of life." When did he say that? Well, he just fed thousands of people with bread. So Jesus would contextualize his I am statements to meet the moment, okay? So Jesus is going to do that at this Feast of Booths. But before we get there, he has this really interesting interaction with his family. Jesus had brothers and sisters, and at this point in his ministry, I think that his brothers could see that this was really growing, that his popularity and fame were growing, and so they want to start to weigh in on, what they think the right next step for Jesus is. So his brothers, they say, "Why are you out here in the country? Why are you doing all these things in rural Galilee? If you're going to do miracles, go to the big city. Go to Jerusalem. There's more people there. If you're going to make messianic claims, don't do that out in the country. Do that in the big city. Do that in Jerusalem." Okay, in Jewish tradition, it was believed by Jesus' brothers, by other Jews, that the Messiah would appear not in rural Galilee, but way out in Jerusalem, in the big city. So they're trying, probably thinking they're right, to get him to follow their schedule to go to Jerusalem so that he could show himself to the world. But what does verse 5 say? What's their real reason? For not even his brothers believed in him. At this point in Jesus' ministry, not even his brothers, the people who've grown up with him, who've listened to him talk and watched him walk through life, they didn't even believe in him. Now we know that later at least two of his brothers did believe in him. What were their names? James and Jude. Okay, you guys are with me. James and Jude. And we know that because James and Jude wrote New Testament letters. But at this point, they didn't even believe. And so his brothers are trying to coerce him into doing something that is out of step with God's schedule for Jesus. But what does Jesus do? He always brings it back to his Father's timing. Look what he says. He says, "My time has not yet come." Have you guys heard that in John before? Way back in John 2, Jesus' first miracle, the wedding at Cana. His mom wanted him to turn the water to wine, and what did he say? "My time has not yet come." So even when the people closest to Jesus wanted him to do certain things, he would always look to his spiritual Father in heaven, and he would look to his timing. Jesus clearly knows that his brothers don't know him at this point because Jesus says, "Your time is always here. The world cannot hate you." And what he's saying is, the world loves you because you belong to the world. Right? And so his brothers belong to the world right now. But he keeps going back to his Father's timing. Now, as we walk through these verses, I want to give you guys 4 principles about how we make wise decisions, about how we judge rightly. Okay? So here is principle number 1. How do I judge rightly? Commit to God's timeline. Jesus was utterly committed to his Father's schedule for his life. It didn't matter when his family had a different schedule for him. It didn't matter when the Jewish people had a different schedule for him. Jesus was never in a hurry. Now, Jesus was never in a hurry, but think about this. Nobody ever accomplished more in 3 years of ministry or 33 years of life than Jesus. Yet he was never in a hurry. Because Jesus was committed to God's timeline, he could fall asleep in the bottom of a boat that was in the middle of a storm. Because Jesus was on his Father's timeline, he didn't feel like he had to rush to the crowds in Jerusalem to make himself known. Jesus was never in a hurry. He was always on time because he was on God's time. Now, it's like one pastor, I heard, that he was sitting in his office agitated, and a person walked in and asked why he was agitated. And he said, "The problem is that I'm in a hurry and God isn't." You ever felt that way? I'm in a hurry, but God isn't. That pastor should have listened to the other person who said that he who waits on God loses no time. You're never wasting time when you're waiting on God. In fact, God does some pretty powerful things in our lives when we wait on him, right? I mean, God can do more in a day than we can do in 100 years. So it's okay to wait on him. Now, here's how this kind of plays out in Jesus' life, and I've seen these principles in my life. If you're walking in the Spirit, if you're sensitive to the things of God, you will notice sometimes God opens doors, and sometimes God closes doors. Now, when God opens a door for you, sometimes it might take courage to walk through that door. We call that courage what? Faith. And you've got to be willing to walk through it, just like Jesus was willing to walk through it when it was hard, when he was meeting hostility, when it was going to lead to suffering. But there's other times where God closes doors. When he closes doors you don't want closed. And what do we do sometimes then? We try to beat the door down because we want that in our lives. And Jesus didn't do that. Jesus understood that if his Father was going to close a door, then he shouldn't try to go through it because God is good. And I would say the same thing to all of us. We can listen to our Father's timeline for our lives because he's good. And he knows best. He has all the information. So commit to God's timeline. Let's move to the next section here. We'll call this Jesus and his Father's authority. So look at verse 10 with me. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said he is a good man, others said, "No, he's leading the people astray." Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he's never studied?" So Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood." So Jesus does end up going to the feast. And the assumption here is that at some point, this was a week-long feast, at some point his father said, "Go." But notice that his father didn't tell him to go in the same way or at the same time as his brothers. Because God's ways are higher than our ways. God usually knows how to do things better than we do, right? So his brothers wanted him to go publicly. How does he go? Privately. His brothers wanted him to go at the beginning of the feast. When does he go? About the middle of the feast. And what is the scene at this feast where there's thousands, maybe even 1 million people in Jerusalem? Well, the buzz is all about Jesus. The religious authorities, the religious establishment, they are threatened by Jesus. They are secretly plotting to kill Jesus. They want to shut Jesus down because Jesus is challenging their power. But then all the people have all these divided opinions about him. Some people say he's a good man. But what are other people saying? He's a seducer of the people. He's leading the people astray. Jesus is what we would call polarizing. You know those names that you can't even mention in a conversation without immediately making someone either love you or hate you? Those names, I won't name them, but if I said them from up here, the church would immediately be divided down the middle. We call those names polarizing. That's Jesus at this feast. He's polarizing. It's like you can't even talk about him. Everybody's kind of whispering, muttering about him, but they don't want to be heard by the religious authorities. And that's a key verse. Look at 13. It says, "Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly about him." This leads to principle number 2. How do I judge rightly? Prioritize God's approval. Now, as we keep going in John, this is a theme, this fear of the Jews and the people being afraid to confess Christ because of it. It's talked about in John 9, and then it's talked about in John 12, 42 through 43. And this is actually where we get the answer for why. It says, "Nevertheless, many even of the authorities believed in Jesus, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue." Verse 43 tells us why. "For they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God." That's why. They loved man's approval more than they loved God's approval. The people, the crowds who confessed Christ would be put out of the synagogue, and that was their place of social gathering. That was their place of family and friendships. That was their place of worshiping God. So they didn't want to get put out of the synagogue. And then the Jewish authorities who believed in Jesus, they would likely lose their jobs. So they're in a really tough spot. Now let's bring it to our day. When you're in your workplace, I understand that you can't stand up on your desk in the morning and preach a sermon. Your office might hate you for that. So that'd be a little weird. If you work remotely, you can't send emails to your boss every day that are sermons. I guess you could, but that's not really what I'm asking you to do, and I don't think that's what Jesus is asking you to do. Here's what I will say, though. There comes a time in all of our lives, in work, in our families, in our communities, students in school, where you will be asked to cross certain lines to win man's approval, but that God disapproves of. okay? In the workplace, there may come a time where your boss, for the sake of the company line, the bottom line, wants you to cross a line that God doesn't want you to cross. And you know that if you don't cross that line, your boss will disapprove of you. Students, in your peer groups, whether you're in middle school, high school, college, there will come times where your peers want you to cross moral and ethical lines to win the peers' approval that God does not approve of. And you've got to make a decision. Do I want God's approval or do I want my friend's approval? This comes for all of us. It comes for pastors too. And the question I would ask all of us is, in those moments where it's tough, whose approval are you more worried about? Whose approval are you more worried about? Are you more worried about your friend's approval, your boss's approval, your company's approval, or are you worried about God's approval? Even in our families, which is probably the toughest situation for this. In those moments where family relationships might be frayed because you're choosing God's approval. Which one do you choose? Which one do you choose? Which one did Jesus choose? Well, as always, Jesus chose the right answer. Look at verse 14. It says, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. So Jesus gets up there, he follows God's will right into the buzzsaw of hostility, and he teaches with authority, despite the fact that he knows the hearts of his hearers and that many of them want to kill him. But Jesus wasn't concerned about their approval. He was concerned about his Father's approval. He wasn't concerned about his brother's approval when they wanted him to go to the feast early. He was concerned about his Father's approval. And what a lesson for us. What a lesson for us when it gets hard to choose God's approval. That's always the right decision, even when it costs you relationships at times. And so Jesus gets up, he starts to teach. And it says that the Jews therefore marveled, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? Now, in all probability, Jesus growing up probably attended a local synagogue, okay? But Jesus likely did not have formal or advanced instruction under a recognized rabbi. That's how teachers of the law were trained. They would get under this recognized rabbi and learn from them, and that was a qualification to teach. We know Paul talked about that in Acts 22. Remember, Paul learned under a recognized rabbi named who? Gamaliel. You know, the crowds made the same charges against John and Peter in Acts 4. They said, how can these men speak like this when they're uneducated? What they're basically saying is, these men haven't trained under a recognized rabbi. How are they doing these things? But when you study John, there's a lot of irony in John. You'll find a lot of ironic moments. And here's an ironic moment. That when these Jewish leaders who had their PhDs in biblical studies, who some of them would have had their Old Testaments memorized, when they are confronted with the Scripture made flesh, the Word made flesh, the Word they'd spent their whole lives learning, they treated him as an untaught, unlearned person without the formal qualifications for leadership. That's scary to me as a pastor. As someone who teaches the Word, as someone who studies the Word, as Christians, as people who study the Word, what would we do if Jesus was standing right in front of us? Would we recognize the Word? Would we recognize God? Because they didn't. It's so ironic that they're face to face with the Word in flesh and they don't see it. This leads to principle number 3. How do I judge rightly? Pursue God's wisdom. These religious leaders and these people, they may have had the formal education, but they didn't have God's wisdom. And, you know, education is something, but it's not everything, is it? Jesus didn't have the formal education, but he did have God's wisdom. And in this world, I think you'll agree with this statement, in this world we are drowning in information and starving for truth. We are drowning in knowledge and starving for God's wisdom. But where can we find God's wisdom? Let me give you a few places you can find God's wisdom. Here's one. Walk in the Spirit. Walk in the Spirit. What that means is as you open up the Word, learn the Word, whether that's you reading it through, or whether that's through sermons or talking to other Christians, what do? You obey the Word. You obey the Word. That's what it means to walk in wisdom. That's why the real mark in the church of spiritual maturity is not knowledge of this, it's obedience to this. Some of the wisest people who know God's wisdom the best never went through an education. They just read the Bible and obey it. That's wisdom. Here's another one. Prayer. Jesus, before he made some of his biggest decisions, what did he do? He would go away all night and pray. Before he chose his 12 disciples, he went away all night and prayed. So if the Son of God, who has perfect wisdom, prayed all night for certain decisions, I think we've got to pray too. I mean, we've got to pray if we really want God's wisdom, because there's many decisions we're faced with that are really tough decisions. Here's another big one. Where can we find God's wisdom? Serving. Serving. We live in a very consumeristic society. Would you agree with that? We live in a society where we're barraged with advertisements, with things that say that you are the center of the universe. But serving God in the local church or just in other Christian opportunities, you know what it does? It teaches all of us that we're not the center of Christianity. Jesus is the center of Christianity. And Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. So when we come to church, I hope we're all fed. I hope you leave here feeling better than you came. But at the end of the day, we're not just here to be served. We're here to serve. We're not just here to, get ourselves fed. We're here to worship God. We're here to look at the cross and remember what Jesus did for us. So serving in the church leads to God's wisdom. Some of the wisest people I know in the Christian life are people who serve. And then just the last one I'd say is, there are positives and negatives to the just proliferation of resources out there on the internet or podcasts or YouTube. Like you can just go down rabbit holes and not get out. I understand that. But there are a lot of great resources for godly preaching and sermons and also podcasts. There's some awesome Christian podcasts out there that are biblically based. So maybe that's your way to go a little deeper in God's wisdom. I would also recommend that. So pursue God's wisdom. That's the third principle. Jesus responds in verses 16 through 18, and he just reiterates a lot of the things we've already been talking about. He ties his teaching to God's authority, to God's teaching. He ties his will to God's will, to his Father's will. And he also says that he seeks his Father's glory. He also says that he is true. We know that later in John. What does he say? I am the way and the truth and the life. And so Jesus ties himself to his Father's timing, to his Father's authority. Here's the final one. Jesus and his Father's righteousness. So Jesus says in verse 19, he says, has not Moses given you the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me? The crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus answered them, I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. So, when Jesus says, why are you seeking to kill me? Jesus knows there's a secret plot on his life from the religious leaders. But it's likely that a lot of the people don't know that. So I don't know why they had to call Jesus demon-possessed. That just felt like a low blow. But they say, who's seeking to kill you? They genuinely just might not know. Now, Jesus says, I did one work, and you all marvel at it. What is that work he's talking about? He's talking about his last public miracle in Jerusalem recorded by John. And that was in John 5, 1 through 9. In John 5, 1 through 9, Jesus healed a paralytic man. And on what day did he heal a paralytic man? The Sabbath. Very good. On the Sabbath. And that's when Jesus did a lot of his miracles. And why did he do that? Because he wanted to challenge their judgment about the Sabbath. The Sabbath was one of those touch points where the religious leaders had it wrong. They were misinterpreting the Bible. They were misinterpreting God's purposes on the Sabbath. And so Jesus wants to use that healing on the Sabbath as a case study to teach them and us right judgment. Now he says that you circumcise a man on the Sabbath and you're willing to suspend the Sabbath day, something that's reverent for you, to circumcise a man. But I healed a whole person on the Sabbath, and you condemn me for that. Now let's unpack that. For the rabbis, they judged pretty universally that the body had 248 parts. I don't know how they got there. That was their judgment. 248 parts. And so essentially what Jesus is saying is this. You fix one part through circumcision, 1 out of 248 parts. We know the part. You fix that one part, and you'll suspend the Sabbath for that. I came along and fixed 248 parts, and you condemn me for that. And so he says, judge with right judgment. That's not correct. The word right means honest. It means proper. He's saying, judge honestly. Look at things honestly. Now, we do this in the church a lot. I've found that maybe certain doctrines that were supposed to unite us and supposed to point us toward Christ, what do? They divide us. They make churches hate each other sometimes. You think about doctrines like communion or baptism, which are such gifts from the Lord. What happens? So many Christians end up just bickering and fighting about it. That's not why God gave us communion and baptism. Or God's sovereignty, the fact that Jesus said, you did not choose me, but I chose you. We get up in arms that Jesus would say something like, God chose you, rather than being like, God chose me. That's amazing. And so with many different things in the church, we can tend to just judge by appearances and not judge with right judgment. That's the final principle. How do I judge rightly? Do not judge by appearances. The word for appearances there is literally the face. When it talks about God, it says God does not regard the face. What it means is that God does not look at the outward appearance, but looks at the heart. Remember when little David was out in the field, and his dad, looking at the outward appearance, didn't even welcome David in to possibly be chosen as king? And then God had David called in, even though he didn't look like he was going to be a king. He didn't have the appearance yet. He was a little boy. And what did God say to Samuel? For I do not look at the outward appearance, but I look at the heart. So when we come to matters, whether it's in the church, whether it's in our own lives, we want to judge matters honestly. We don't just regard the face and the external appearance of things. We want to go deeper than that. We want to see the heart of the matter. So how do I judge rightly? Do not judge by appearances. So hopefully, you guys can leave with those 4 principles right there. Commit to God's timeline, prioritize God's approval, pursue God's wisdom, do not judge by appearances. I love what Paul said to Timothy when he was teaching him. He said, think over these things. God will give you wisdom about them. So think over these things and let the Holy Spirit give you wisdom about them in your lives. But lastly, let me just say this. Our faith ultimately is not rooted in principles. I hope that we wouldn't come in here and just say, I've got some principles to help me live a better life on my own. Our faith is rooted in a person. And the ultimate judgment that we are all asked to make before the righteous judge is to give our lives to the judge, to give our lives to the person. Because if you don't do that, you'll never get the principles right. If you don't have Christ in your life, you are blind. You won't be able to see rightly. Now, once we accept Him, then we can follow the principles. But until then, we're going to be blind. And so, let me offer to you what we offer every week here at Prairie Bible Church. Have you embrace the person. Have you embraced the righteous judge? The righteous judge who before the foundation of the world made the decision to save you and to save me. The righteous judge who never made a sinful decision in his life. The righteous judge who voluntarily took it upon himself to get up on a cross and die for us. Have you given your life to the righteous judge? Here's what he asks of you. Confess with your mouth that he is Lord. Believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, and you will be saved. That means repenting of our sin, turning from our sin, and turning to him in faith and not trusting anymore in our effort, but in his finished work. If you will do that, the righteous judge will teach you right judgment through the Holy Spirit.